Welcome back to your next episode. I'm Amy.
And I'm Louise.
How are you doing, Louise?
I'm fine, thank you. Yeah, I was about to say I'm Louise the Invincible, as I'm now referring to myself because I have had the vaccine. And I think just got there just in the nick of time before some sort of this predicted stall in the rollout. And so I'm very pleased that I had that on Saturday. And sad face for you, Amy, but, there's got to be a few perks to being over 50.
It does feel like, I am
Whatever.
kind of like, I'm one of the young ones. Okay, I can't, I'm now branching myself in with the young guns and we're just taking one for the team.
Yeah,
aren't we?
I know. Well, as I say, there's got to be perks to being over 50. And one of those is getting the vaccine and the other one is being able to, gloat about it a bit. So, yeah,
basically, you're just going to be with a load of pensioners raving in Ibiza, aren't you?
I know. And also, probably all you youngsters, you're not going to be able to go on a summer holiday. But I will send you a postcard from mine, or rather, I'll obviously be Instagram storying.
I might have to just delete the app that week.
Yeah, there is a danger. I think that I might get carried away this summer because, I am someone who's easily led. I'm overexcitable, and I have a feeling that this summer there is going to be a lot of opportunity to really whoop it up, and I'm really there for that. Has anything remotely exciting happened for you, Amy, this week that compares to my vaccine?
We'll just get left behind, shall we? We'll just get left behind. Yeah, I have spoken to a few friends who work in the NHS, and so a few of them who work in doctor surgeries, they've had their jabs, and they're sort of like, oh, do you fancy doing this? Do you fancy doing that? And I'm kind of like, oh, the freedom to be able to just plan something. Well, no, I don't know if I'll be able to come to Glastonbury's not happening, is it? But some other like festival or something. I'm kind of like, oh, you're going to be there with your fully shielded immunity. I'll just be withering in the corner.
Absolutely. Well,
no, I'm really glad that you've had it done. We've got to protect our vulnerable and our elderly, haven't we? So.
Fuck off. Okay, so shall we move on to our guest this week, who has written a book that is so good that I've had to abandon the book that I'm actually reading, that I was already reading at the moment. So our guest this week is Professor Jane Monckton-Smith, and she's written this book on the back of her groundbreaking research. It was that it got so much attention into coercive relationships and how they escalate to murder, and the book's called In Control, Dangerous Relationships and How They End in Murder. And as I say, I got it on Thursday. I haven't finished it, but it's fascinating, horrifying, and totally unputdownable, and really important because the numbers are so high and the society's quite frankly a bit clueless about the issues around it, really. So this is stuff that we all need to start to hear and understand.
Yeah, and if that does sound like, I feel a bit sad today or I feel a bit down today, then maybe don't listen to it today. But I would suggest that you do listen to it, because there are so many little nuggets in there, isn't there? We stumble across, probably nothing that anybody's not stumbled across before, but we just about communicating this message. So Jane is a former police officer. She's a world-renowned criminology expert. Enjoy this chat with her coming up next.
Welcome, Jane, and thanks so much for being our guest today. So, and I think I said in the email, I struggle to shrink my questions down now that I've started reading your book, which is such a good book, and I think I really gushed about it in the email. So I'd really recommend anyone. We're going to talk about that. It's called In Control, Dangerous Relationships and How They End in Murder. So, as I say, struggling to rein myself in with questions. So let's just focus on the conversation that I know you feel needs to change for all of us, not just for the people who respond to domestic abuse and homicide. But can we just start by asking you to introduce yourself? So who are you and what do you do?
I'm Jane Monckton-Smith. I'm Professor of Public Protection at the University of Gloucestershire, and my specialism is in homicide. Just recently, especially, I have been working a lot in intimate partner homicide.
So your book, who would you say the book is for? Like, how has it come to you writing that?
Well, I started off, the book is based on a piece of academic research that I did. I don't work full time as an academic, as it were. I work a lot outside of the university as well. And I was doing an awful lot of work with bereaved families bereaved through homicide. And I was doing a lot of work as well with the police. And there just seemed to be this kind of disconnect between the families and the police and professional views and views of victims, which I wanted to bridge that gap. But as the research went on, it was so important. And when we published it as research, it was like this tsunami of interest from both sides, from victims, from families, and from professionals as well. But you know what it's like with academic papers. They can be very inaccessible. They can be difficult to read, and even myself as an academic, it's like wading through treacle with some of them, you know. But it was so important. I just thought I'd write a book for everyone to understand this research.
Mm-hmm. And you describe domestic homicide as a pandemic so pervasive that soaring figures cause weary resignation rather than alarm. I thought it was a really interesting quote, actually. And when I do look at the figures, I just feel so overwhelmed. It's like, what do we do about this? I mean, firstly, how prevalent are these domestic murders? The
domestic murders themselves, that's the largest category of homicide we have for women dying. And that's global. That's every country across the world has got the same problem. So that makes it rather alarming. In the UK, we've got probably more than 2 a week happening, and in some countries it's worse.
And I guess over lockdown it's been worse, Jane, has it? I mean, that's the scary thing, isn't it?
Absolutely. When lockdown started last March for us, within 30 days the homicide rate had doubled for women. So this is a real problem, and I'm doing some more work, in fact, which is a project I call Hidden Homicides, and that's revealing the homicides that we don't count. Yes. So not only is our global femicide figures rising when homicide itself is going down, we've also had this massive rise with the pandemic, and then we've got these homicides we're not even counting.
What do you mean by that, we're not counting? Why aren't we counting?
Well, a lot of the work I do is kind of advocating for bereaved families and helping police as well with cold cases, things like that. And these are all cases where the death has not been formally recorded as a homicide.
Oh.
But there are suspicions, or there's not enough evidence to prosecute somebody, or, the evidence wasn't gathered at the time, people are still missing, but they all follow this 8-stage pattern. Yes. So that raises suspicion.
Yeah.
So the numbers are bigger than we think even.
Yeah. Can I just go back to, at the core of everything you write or analyse is a woman that you talk about right at the beginning of your book, that you were called out to as a newly qualified police officer in the early 80s. Can you just tell us that story and what it was about her actions, those of her boyfriend, that underlie your sort of understanding around coercive control and domestic abuse and murder?
Yes, well, I was newly qualified. Oh God, I'm going to give my age away if I say this now. I mean, I was about 19 years old when I went to this call. So, and I went with a very experienced sergeant who was, because I was still being supervised at that time. So we went into this house, and the paramedics had got there before us. So they're standing with this young girl, probably about my age, if not younger. In fact, she's just sitting there, just staring. She's not talking, she's not moving, but she's got blood trickling down the back of her neck. And the paramedics said to us, well, she's been hit in the head with a lump hammer by her boyfriend. So they were really concerned that she would have maybe a fractured skull or something like that. So they were trying to talk her into getting into the ambulance and going to the hospital with them. she just wouldn't do it. She would not get in the ambulance. She just sat there. She sat quietly. Her boyfriend's gone. He'd gone. He wasn't anywhere to be found. And, me and my sergeant looking at each other thinking, well, if she won't get in the ambulance, she's not going to support a prosecution. And you can only stay so long. You've got voices in your ear. You've got other jobs to go to. And in the end, we had to leave, all of us, the paramedics, me and my sergeant. And I was just thinking, why won't she get in the ambulance? This is crazy. I'd never come across anything like this before. And he just said to me, Jane, get used to it. This is what they're like. And, as I say in the book, he was a lovely man, really kind, really lovely man. So he wasn't saying it out of any... he wasn't being nasty or prejudiced. No. But I thought, what kind of answer is that? That doesn't explain anything, because what he's actually saying, isn't he, is domestic abuse victims behave differently to the rest of us. So
then when he said referred to that's what they're like, he meant domestic abuse victims, so different to... Yeah, so they don't think like us. They're this special group of women who are a bit weird, and we can't work out why they behave like they do, but they do, so we just accept it. That was his answer to me. And as I say, there was nothing nasty in that answer. No. But, the thing is, these days, we're still asking the same question. We are still saying, why won't they prosecute? Why don't they leave? Yeah.
Okay. And it's interesting because I guess, like you say, he was an experienced sergeant, but it was that almost that weary resignation that you spoke of what can we actually do? We don't have any powers to arrest her and put her in the ambulance, or we can't he's obviously seen this over and over and over again. And like you say, nothing has changed, has it? And we're talking mainly, aren't we, about women being murdered by men here?
Oh, we definitely are. And that is, I do talk about men being killed by women in the book as well. But when you look at the statistics, this is really a gendered problem. So, 82%, if you go from what the United Nations say, it's 82% of victims will be women. Of the 18% left, about half of them at least will be men murdered by another man, so gay men murdered by a male partner. And of say 9% left, a proportion of them will be women responding to domestic abuse.
Self-defense, yeah.
Self-defense. And then you've got this kind of 5%, 6% proportion left who are actually killing their husbands for much the same reason that husbands kill their wives. But you can see the numbers are so telling. You can't really say this is a problem that affects men and women equally.
No. Okay.
Yeah, and I think it's quite interesting as well. I've seen a lot of stuff over the last few weeks, especially with everything that's happened. Louise and I talked about this. You tend to get it a lot with these women that are in their sort of 60s. Maybe they've got all boys. That's not all the time, but it just seems to be a pattern that I've seen follow, where it's like this sort of, women kill men as well in relationships, and the hashtag not all men thing, that does seem to be, and as you say, the statistically you cannot compare the two, can you?
Not with homicide. You really can't. There is no argument to say that there's any parity at all, and that is globally acknowledged.
Just going back to thinking about the behaviour and what your understanding around all of this is. So when these men murder their partners, it is rarely an isolated incident, is it? It's not like a sudden flipping out, losing their temper in an out of character way, is it?
No, it isn't. But that is the way we've explained it for millennia.
That crimes of passion thing. Yeah. Okay. Yes.
And in some countries, the crime of passion defence is actually written into the law.
Wow.
We're actually saying this is what happens with intimate partner homicides, and that I'm afraid is half the problem.
Right. Okay. So in a minute we'll move on to because that's where your 8-stage homicide timeline sort of came in. But those myths that we keep believing about victims and perpetrators of abuse, along the crimes of passion thing. Why do we believe them, do you think?
Well, they're ready-made stories. I mean, it's been part of our storytelling for, since we started telling stories, that this is why men kill their partners, is because they get a bit jealous or they get a bit angry and the red mist comes down. And in a moment of passion, they grab the nearest weapon and kill their wife. The evidence, just says that is a complete myth. I mean, I could swear and say it's a load of, but it's a complete myth.
Yeah. Right.
So it's a pattern, isn't it, that builds up? Like you say, it's not just out of the blue. It's those things that get normalised, isn't it? Would you talk us through the 8-stage homicide timeline, Jane?
Yeah, I'll just be very, very brief about each stage. But we start at stage 1, focusing just on the perpetrator. So this is before they've even met anybody else. So that throws out of the water straight away that it's a dynamic between two people, that if they just left each other, this wouldn't happen. Everybody could go back to having a quiet life. That is not what's happening. These people will be the same, irrespective of who their partner is. So the way that I kind of characterize stage 1 is to say this person has a history. So if they have a history of abuse or stalking or violence, then that means they're going to behave like that in every relationship they have. So it's a really good red marker, somebody who might be very difficult to be in a relationship with.
Before you go on to the other stages, can I just ask about that one? Because this is the one that stood out for me as, so should we be checking before we start a relationship? How do we do that?
Yeah, we should. Absolutely, we should. Because if let's just say, for argument's sake, they're a type. Right? They are a type. So you should then perhaps look for those characteristics. And even if you're not going to leave that person, at least you will educate yourself into what might be up ahead for you, and may not be taken in by so much of the gaslighting and some of the things that are said to justify the control that's probably coming up ahead.
Right. Okay.
I'm just thinking, as ever, Jane, this is what I do on this podcast. I kind of overshare and then think about my own experience. And I do think about exes that I've had who have been, that thing where they're checking your phone and obviously at the time being in my 20s thinking, I can't be arsed with this, fuck off. That doesn't necessarily mean that ex of mine will then go on to kill somebody, but you're saying that it's just a pattern of what if they meet somebody further along the line, and so what you're saying is it's not necessarily, we can't keep looking at the woman of she brought that murderous side out in him. Is it just sort of in your DNA personality?
Like I've said, very, very broadly speaking, we could say they are a type.
Right.
Okay, so however they came to be that type, there are multiple routes to that. Obviously, there will be. Some of them will have maybe antisocial personality disorders. Some of them are just maybe very dependent people who are dependent on the relationship for their identity and their status and all sorts of things. But then you overlay that with the messages from society and culture and religion and law that all say, basically, men are entitled to control their families, entitled to control their partners. And we don't have to look at, if you look globally, there are still countries in the world where that is actually explicitly still written into the law. So you get somebody who's maybe dependent or is narcissistic, who is also being taught this is your right. And then... that justifies everything they do.
We'll let you carry on with the homicide timeline. So the first point is that pre-relationship history.
It is having a history, but the big red flags: possessiveness, jealousy, and trying to control you. Massive red flags.
Okay.
So the second stage is when you meet this person, when this person meets somebody they want to be in a relationship with, and there's two things that characterize this, what I call the early relationship stage. And that is speed and commitment. So they will try, in most cases, to try and push the relationship to beginning at a very fast speed. They'll justify this through the language of passion again. The
whirlwind romance,
Yeah, absolutely. But the real sinister thing that I found in this stage wasn't so much the speed. Lots and lots of people go at speed. Shouldn't do, but they do. Is the commitment bit. So in this very controlling person's head, who feels entitled to have some control, once you give them a commitment, or they perceive that you've given them a commitment, you can never actually withdraw that. That's it. You've kind of signed a contract in blood in their head. You won't necessarily know that. You won't know that. But once they have the commitment, they feel then that they've got all those rights that society gives them. And, and at that stage, then, once the commitment is given, it can be, I'm not saying they all end in murder, because they don't.
No.
But the relationship will probably very quickly move to being very controlling.
Okay, so that's that second point. So moving on, third point is relationship.
And so you've been through, you've given a commitment to this person, and they take their commitment in different ways. For some of them, it's first time you have sex with them. That'll be it. That's what they think. But so once you've given that commitment, you're then in that we're in a relationship together stage. And this is the stage that will be quite controlling. They will try and have control and influence over everything that you do. For some, that control will be intense and it will be absolutely awful. For some, maybe it won't be violent, but you'll be still kind of treading on eggshells around them. If you know what I mean. I better not do this, or it's not worth it. I'm not going to do that because it's just not worth it. I think that's something you said earlier, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's just not worth it. And this stage can go on for 3 weeks or 50 odd years.
Right. Yeah. And it also, as you're sort of talking about that, like we've all known people who have partners where that treading on eggshells. So it's not necessarily you go, oh my God, they're coercive control and they're really abusive, but that if you're having to tread on eggshells around someone and be like, oh yeah.
And sometimes the control comes in, and it's like stealth almost sometimes. For some, it really is not. And you might find yourself when you wake up one day and think, oh my God, I can't do anything. Or I don't want to do this because I know I won't go and see my mum, because if I go and see my mum, there'll just be consequences to that. So I can't, and then you find yourself, your life getting smaller and smaller and smaller.
Because friends become a bad influence, don't they? And other outside influences become, they're leading you astray, don't they? It's so insidious, it's so subtle. And actually, I am thinking about the Archers as we're talking. Do you remember that storyline with Helen Archer?
Yes.
And I guess even these conversations that we're having, if we're talking about it more, I mean, I guess in some societies, like you were saying, Jane, this wouldn't even be a conversation that we could have. But I guess if we are at least getting those signs, especially to our daughters and our sons, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. It should be going out to everybody that this is, we've got to start telling boys and men in many, many different ways, you don't own your families and your partners and your children. You don't own them. You have no right to own them.
So then we've got the fourth point.
Yeah, the fourth stage is what we call the trigger stage. When we're talking about a homicide timeline, this is usually separation. So coercive control, this relationship part, is actually designed to trap somebody in the relationship. It's that commitment thing. It's to stop them leaving. Nothing to do with love. Nothing to do with love. A lot of these people are in multiple relationships. They're having affairs and things, and they will be equally as controlling of all of the people they're in relationships with. This is in them. This is not the victim's fault. So the biggest trigger is separation, or something that suggests separation will come as a result of a different life happening. So if we just accept for the moment that it's separation, because that is by far the most common, then you've got a situation where everything they've been guarding against, everything that they have been putting in place has now been challenged. And that's when the danger starts to rise, which is what pushes us then into stage 5. Okay, so stage 5 is a response to this challenge. Maybe she said, I'm leaving you. Maybe he thinks she's having an affair, So when we go into stage 5, this is like what I call the escalation stage. So there's a response to the trigger. Usually that response will be to escalate all of the control tactics so that they regain the control they thought they'd lost or had lost. It's at this stage that we really find out how dangerous somebody is. So in this stage, stalking usually starts. So let's just say, for example, the relationship doesn't get back together. The woman says, no, I'm done. That's it. I'm staying gone. Now, it might be that person eventually stops stalking, stops harassing, whatever. They circle back then to stage 1 with somebody with a history. It could be, and this happens in so many cases, the relationship actually does get back together. Because either the woman is scared not to go back or feels sorry for the person. Because, escalation tactics can be begging and crying. Yeah. It's not all about necessarily nasty violence and things like that.
And also, those women are just human. And if you've been told over and over again by somebody that no one will love you the way that I do, nobody's going to adore you the way and worship you the way that I do, and then you're on your own, you're just human, and you're... Yeah, I can see how that pattern happens.
Well, what they often do is go back to the love bombing kind of behaviours. But some of them, for an awful lot of women, it's actually fear of leaving. They're too scared to leave. And going back and getting back into the nice stage of the relationship is safer than thinking, no, I can't do this anymore. Because you need a lot of things in place. You've got kids with this person, you can't just walk away and that's the end of them. And the most important thing we need to remember is leaving someone does not end the abuse. So when we say, why don't you just leave, in our heads we're thinking, well, if you just left, the abuse would stop. Of course it doesn't.
It won't. No.
It carries on into stage 5, and that can be so very difficult to deal with and frightening. So we see a lot that the relationship gets back together, and we see couples circling between stages 3, 4, 5, 3, 4, 5, 3, 4, 5 on this endless cycle where, the challenges keep happening, whatever they might be, and then everything gets back together. The most dangerous thing is when neither of those things happen. So doesn't go back to stage 1, doesn't go back to stage 3, moves on to stage 6. That's when we get real danger. So up to stage 5, that's practically every domestic abuse relationship. Right. Stage 6 is not. That's when we start to get quite specific.
So stage 6 is those... that sort of change in thinking.
Yeah. Shall I just explain the change in thinking?
Yes, please.
Yeah. And other academics have kind of explained this. So there's Professors Russell and Rebecca Dobash, who are domestic abuse researchers for years now. They said the kind of game changes from keeping the person in the relationship to punishing them for leaving it. Right. So, if you wanted it in a headline, I suppose that really captures it. That's what's happening. So stage 6 is about, okay, we've moved on. I don't want her back now. It's irretrievable. What am I going to do about this? How am I going to resolve it? And in stalking research, this kind of change in thinking is referred to a little bit as last chance thinking. So it's that kind of, right, it's either going to be this or this. And in this stage 6 is where they decide how they're going to resolve it. And a lot of them at this stage may decide to homicide.
Wow. Yeah. So So it's a thought through thing.
Yes, and some of them will have had that thought in their head the entire relationship.
Yeah, since stage 2 or 3.
Yeah, absolutely. Some of them won't. It depends on the individual. They're not all the same.
No. Okay. And then we move on to stage 7.
Stage 7 is the one that I think causes people the most difficulty, and there's a lot of resistance to thinking about stage 7 because that's the planning stage. Now, if we believe in the crime of passion, the planning stage does not exist. No. It doesn't exist. So you're trying to push that wall down where people are saying crime of passion and say, no, planning. I'm sorry, planning. And depending on the personality type of perpetrator, the planning stage could last 12 hours, or it could last, in one of our cases in the research, nearly 18 months.
Wow. God. Yeah.
But it does exist. Yeah. I know it's a horrible message to have to put out there, but it really does exist.
Yeah. We need to know this, don't we?
Yeah. Absolutely.
And I know the conversation now, it's getting very, very down, and it's not nice to think about this. It really, really isn't. But if we don't start thinking about this in this way, we're not going to be able to keep women safe.
And we'll be having this conversation 30 years from now, won't we?
And also, and I'm sure this will happen for lots of people listening, as you're going through those stages, I'm thinking immediately, I've got friends popping into my head that I'm like, I know this has happened. I recognise what you're saying as a stage. I mean, I haven't had any friends who've been killed, but just everything you're saying, I'm recognising it. So
it's out there. We know.
It really is, yeah. And, when we back at the beginning, when we were talking about how huge the numbers are, it sort of was a surprise to me how big the numbers were. But then when I stopped and think about it, I'm like, no, when I sit with my friends and we talk about relationships that we've all had throughout our lives, because we're all in our 50s now, we will go back to, and there are some that we'll laugh about them because thankfully
lucky escape.
We didn't stay in those relationships. But then there are things that you're like, oh my God, like that behaviour was exactly what you're describing here. And so stage 8 is the homicide.
And that can also, play out in many ways. It can be a homicide, suicide, missing person. Children get killed too. Other people can get killed too. Yeah. It's a very highly dangerous situation.
Yeah. Basically, when it ends in that homicide, you can go back and almost always see those 8 stages. Yes. And this is what people need to be aware of. So I suppose, what could I do if I knew of someone, I'm listening to this and going, hang on a minute, what can I do to support that person to get out of that situation? Because again, we go back to what that police officer said in that case donkeys years ago, your first, about, that's the way they behave. And why do victims behave like we talked about it a bit, because they're scared? What can we do?
It's about consequences. Well, really what we have to recognise is that the way domestic abuse victims think is the same way all of us think. There's nothing different about them at all. And most of the time they are making quite skilled decisions about their own safety. So if they're saying to you, I'm not going to leave, there's a reason for that, and it will be a logical reason. If you've got a situation, what I should have said, right, to the woman who wouldn't get in the ambulance, which I didn't know then, but I would say to her now is, what are the consequences of you getting in this ambulance? That's what I would say now to her. And she might say to me, if I get in that ambulance, you'll bloody kill me. And then, all of a sudden, she's not this weird person who we don't understand. And I could then say, well, do you think there's anything we could do to make you safer so that when he finds out that you've been in the ambulance, your safety is assured? Those are the kinds of conversations that we should be having. We should always remember that whether the victim thinks the relationship is happy or doesn't, it doesn't really matter. No. Always speak to them about what would happen if, so that you then are saying to them, I understand that you're not just making stupid decisions. which is a very judgmental approach to take anyway, isn't it? What are the consequences for you of making this decision?
Right, right. And then what? Try and get something in place for them?
Well, the trouble is this is a long game sometimes.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's a short game. So when you're talking about somebody's safety, that's what that's where your focus must be. So if you've got a friend, they're in a relationship, they're not actually going to leave yet. They might in the future. So there are things you can do. You must never approach the perpetrator, ever. Do not do that, because the consequences of that for the victim are too much. But you can do things like you can keep an emergency pack in your house, money, clothes, ID, all of those kinds of things that this person may need if they take the decision to leave and they think it's dangerous. You can be that person who listens, who lets them know that there is somebody they can trust outside of the relationship who isn't going to make things worse because they understand. Going to the police can be very much, well, if you're not going to prosecute, we can't do anything for you. Already they've shown that they don't understand, but there are consequences for me of that. I do think the police are getting much, much better.
It is going to take some more training so that next 19-year-old police officer, or however old they are, experienced they are, can ask those questions. And I don't know, perhaps other services getting involved at that stage, or
well, it needs to be multi-agency training, doesn't it? But the most frustrating thing I have come across is our courts. It's the courts that, no matter, you can have a police officer who's trained up to their eyebrows. They know exactly what to say. They know exactly what to do. We're going to get this guy with a restraining order. We're going to lock him up, whatever they're going to do. And then it gets to court, all bets are off. And you can't guarantee for the victim then what's going to happen. So it's actually safer to not maybe roll that ball.
Yeah, and also I guess they're in danger of making promises that they can't keep.
Yes, exactly. And then once that happens, the trust is gone, and it is in fact safer to stay.
So if you're supporting somebody that you know is going through this, and you've spoken to them and they have confided in you, and your role there then is to be a support and to have those practical things in place, offer to have those practical things in place. What do you do if that's, say, your friend's husband, or let's say maybe your mum's new partner or something? Do you then be friendly towards that person? Because you said you don't approach them because that will make it worse. So do you keep up a pretense of, you go along with in front of everybody, we're all acting as if everything's fine, you keep that a secret from the perpetrator? That
might be what you have to do.
So you
would talk to the victim about that. You might want to go and punch them on the nose. And a lot of people would feel like that. And I think I've just been through this with my own daughter, so I absolutely know what this feels like. And she, to be fair, was terrified that I would say something in front of him that was critical. So I didn't.
So you were just friendly and...
I was non-critical. I did treat him very neutral. I wasn't mates with him. I couldn't manage that. But some people are in the position where they have to be. And really, because so many victims are pressurised through this kind of loyalty requirement to present a happy front. If you come in and you're annoying them, you're critical, you're basically saying, she's told me all about you. No matter how you feel, that's probably not the best thing.
And in your book you sum it up as needing to be consistent, reliable, trustworthy, the opposite of him. So kind, strong, and non-judgmental. And that's
and show you understand that this, you're not ever going to say to somebody, why don't you just leave? If they're talking to you and it feels like the conversation's got to that stage where leaving is appropriate to talk about, I would say, gosh, what would happen if you left? Not why don't you?
Yeah.
Because it does very much put this is your responsibility to leave, when actually they have they don't really have any control in that situation.
No, they don't. So always, what would happen if? What are the consequences of?
Yeah.
Not why don't you?
No. Okay.
When you are sort of pouring through all of these probably sometimes quite graphic and gory details, how do you, like Jane, how do you process that? You know, like, I did find myself at the beginning of lockdown thinking, oh God, I'm just so grateful, because I was seeing the stuff on the news about how the numbers to Childline has gone up and the numbers to domestic abuse telephone charity numbers have gone up, and there is that thing, isn't there, of that thing of thinking, oh God, I'm so glad that I'm safe and I'm all right, and it's almost too much for me to kind of compute and process. But how do you deal with that? Don't say vodka.
No. Can I say gin?
Yes, gin.
Gin and Rothmans. Yeah. I'm not the same person I was 10 years ago even. So my life has changed because it's just full of murder. I mean, on a daily basis, I'm just dealing with these cases, but I never, ever get used to it. I never, ever do. I spend a lot of time with bereaved family. In fact, most of my friends now are people bereaved through homicide. We've formed relationships, and, you know, so this is my life now. And I think I spend far too much time angry and frustrated, far too much time sad, and more time now hopeful as well. Can
I just ask, for anybody that's sort of going through, a woman that is going through this, so rather than someone that than a friend, where can they get support? Well,
there are places, every single place in the UK anyway, and I think it's the same in across the world really, and maybe not in some places. There will be a domestic abuse support service. You can phone them in complete confidence, and they are not going to say to you, you must report this to the police or you must leave. They are going to talk through your situation with you and perhaps give you some advice on what to do if you ever get to the stage where you do want to leave, or what you can do to make yourself safer. So that is definitely, there's every area has that service. A lot of them are run by Women's Aid, but many of them are not. So just look, if you Google my local domestic abuse service.
Yeah, okay.
But there are also for people who may, their relationships have split up, they've left, and they're frightened because their ex is stalking them. There are stalking services as well. Right. And there is the National Domestic Abuse Helpline, and there is the National Stalking Helpline. So there's plenty of places you can go to for support and advice. You can go to the police. They, when you go to the police, especially now, they're not going to just phone up your partner and say, guess what, we've heard about you.
No.
Or, no, we're actually going to take this all out of your hands and we're going to arrest him. And it won't be like that. And the police can, if they consider that you're at quite high risk of harm, not necessarily homicide, but harm, they can form a multi-agency meeting. You can speak to your GP. You can speak to nurses in A&E departments. They're all trained now.
Okay.
So,
right.
Disclose somewhere safe, but don't be frightened to disclose.
No. Thank you.
And I'm sure that for anybody who is listening, just being able to listen to these things and think, oh, shit, this is my life, or as you were saying before, Louise, somebody that you know, I guess that is a huge stage, isn't it, to even breaking out of to realising that there is a problem.
Yes.
Can I just, on a very much lighter note, ask you about I read that you used to be. I'm just going to right. So you've done all this academic research, right? And then you've written your book. So I'm thinking, just all pretty impressive stuff. And then I read that you actually were a lead singer in a rock band for 10 years. Is that correct?
I was.
How fantastic!
I'm just like, and I was thinking, well, maybe when we meet her, she actually won't turn out to be that nice, or because I'm just like, what? Like, she's really, really clever, and she's written a really good book, and and then now she's. It's just like, you are the person that I would like to be.
I was going to say, Louise is just jealous, Jane.
Really jealous.
Oh, is that what it is?
So, well, you just took 10 years out. You were a police officer. Can you just talk me through that? Because I really am curious. So,
yeah, I think what they call it now is your career taking a wiggly path.
Really wiggly.
A really, really wiggly path. And mine certainly did that. I just, I'd been in the police, and it's a very disciplined, hierarchical, rigid organisation. And I just think I rebelled against that and just went and did something where there was no rules for a while.
Yeah.
And
we're always talking to people on this podcast about, like you get to that stage in your life. So how old were you when the wiggle in the path happened?
I was coming up towards, I guess I was about 27, 28.
Yeah.
Right.
So I was still young.
Yeah.
Young enough. I was still young. It wasn't a midlife crisis.
No, okay.
Because that's what I want to do now, you see. I want to be in a rock band now, but I'm 51, which is, I don't think any rock band, but if there are any rock bands listening, I'm up for it, basically.
Or up for it.
You're like Professor Debbie Harry.
Yes!
I wish.
You are!
Debbie Harry was my absolute hero. Absolute hero. I'd have given anything to be her, but...
Instead, you're changing the world, Jane.
Yes,
so
absolutely.
This is really important work. And I can totally imagine how you just think, no, I just want to go and, go in the mosh pit? Or
Yeah.
Well, we will put links to the book in the show notes because it is such a good book. Because as you said at the beginning, reading through research stuff is like that's not my bag at all. And I think I said to you in the email that I got the book on Thursday, and I thought, I'll have a skim through because obviously I'm interviewing this woman. So I didn't have. I just ended up just sitting there for like 2 hours, just turning each page because it's a really, really good book. It's really interesting and informative, and and it's something. It kind of just. I think it's something that obviously we all need to have a conversation about and be aware of.
That's what I'm hoping. I want us to start having conversations and have different ones to the ones we have been having.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, thank you ever so much, Jane.
Thank you. Lovely to chat to you.
Thank you.
A podcast from producer Paul